The sun was setting over Marcus Wheeler's failing ranch in eastern Colorado when he made a decision that would expose a web of corruption reaching the highest levels of local government. What started as a desperate attempt to save his family's three-generation legacy would uncover something far darker than financial ruin, and the 12-year-old boy who changed everything wasn't even supposed to be there. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Wheeler had always believed that hard work and honest living would see him through any storm. At 52, his weathered hands told the story of 3 decades spent maintaining the Wheeler Ranch, a 2,400-acre spread that had been in his family since his grandfather, Samuel Wheeler, first purchased the land in 1952. But belief doesn't pay overdue mortgage notices, and honesty doesn't fill empty grain silos. The drought had lasted 18 months. What started as a particularly dry spring had stretched into a relentless siege against everything Marcus held dear. The Platte River, which had reliably fed his cattle for generations, now ran at barely a trickle. The grasslands that once stretched, green and abundant across his property, had turned brown and brittle, crackling under the hooves of livestock that grew thinner by the week. Standing in his kitchen at dawn, Marcus stared at the stack of red-lettered envelopes piled on his table. Each one represented another piece of his world, crumbling away. The mortgage payment, 3 months behind, the equipment loan for the tractor that now sat broken in his barn, a repair he couldn't afford, the feed bills that accumulated faster than he could manage, the property taxes that the county demanded, regardless of whether his land produced anything worth selling. His wife Sarah had left 6 months ago, taking their 2 teenage daughters with her to live with her sister in Denver. She hadn't been cruel about it. Sarah Wheeler was incapable of cruelty, but her words still echoed in the empty house. "I can't watch you kill yourself over dirt and cattle, Marcus. The girls need stability, and I need to know they'll have food on the table." Marcus understood her decision, even respected it, but understanding didn't ease the ache of eating dinner alone every night in a house that once buzzed with family conversation and laughter. The neighboring ranchers weren't faring much better. Tom Brennan had already sold his place to a development company from California. The Martinez family had been forced into bankruptcy the previous winter. Even Bill Hutchinson, whose operation was twice the size of Marcus's, was considering offers from corporate buyers who wanted to convert ranch land into shopping centers and housing developments. This was the reality that brought Marcus to the decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. There was only one option left that might generate enough immediate income to keep the bank from foreclosing, leasing his land for temporary agricultural labor operations. It wasn't something he was proud of, but companies would pay premium rates for land use during harvest seasons, and they handled all the logistics of bringing in workers and managing operations. Marcus had heard about these arrangements from other desperate ranchers. The companies would lease sections of land, bring in crews to work crops that required intensive manual labor, and pay the landowner a percentage of profits plus a flat rental fee. It wasn't traditional ranching, but it was legal income that could arrive within weeks rather than months. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Marcus drove his pickup truck to the offices of Meridian Agricultural Solutions in the small town of Fairfield, about 40 miles from his ranch. The company operated out of a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of town, surrounded by similar businesses that dealt in bulk commodities and large-scale farming equipment. The man who met him was named David Kowalski, a thin, efficient individual in his mid-40s who wore pressed khakis and a company polo shirt. Kowalski's office was sparse but professional, decorated with photographs of various agricultural operations and certificates from farming associations. "Mr. Wheeler, I understand you're interested in our land partnership program. Kowalski said, gesturing for Marcus to sit in one of two chairs facing his desk. "We've been expanding our operations in this region, and your property has several characteristics that make it ideal for our needs." Marcus nodded, feeling slightly uncomfortable but pushing forward. "I need to generate income quickly, and traditional cattle ranching isn't viable right now with the drought conditions." "Completely understandable. Weather patterns have been particularly challenging for traditional livestock operations." Kowalski pulled out a folder containing several documents. "Our typical arrangement involves a 6-month lease of designated acreage, during which time we establish temporary crop operations that require intensive harvesting. We provide all equipment, materials, and labor. You receive a base rental fee plus 15% of net profits." The numbers Kowalski presented were substantial, enough to cover Marcus's overdue mortgage payments and provide operating capital for the remainder of the year. The contract seemed straightforward, with Meridian taking full responsibility for all aspects of the agricultural operation. "What type of crops are we talking about?" Marcus asked, reviewing the paperwork. "Primarily vegetables that require hand harvesting. Tomatoes, peppers, leafy greens, crops that can't be efficiently harvested with machinery." Kowalski leaned back in his chair. "We've developed relationships with distributors who specifically require this type of produce, so there's a guaranteed market." Marcus spent an hour reviewing the contract details. The legal language was complex, but the essential terms seemed fair. Meridian would lease 300 acres of his land for 6 months, establish temporary growing operations, and handle all aspects of production and harvesting. Marcus would retain ownership of his property and resume normal operations when the lease expired. "When would operations begin?" Marcus asked. "We can have crews on your property within 2 weeks. The first rental payment would be issued upon signing." Kowalski slid a check across the desk. "This represents the first month's base rental fee." The amount on the check was exactly what Marcus needed to bring his mortgage current. After 18 months of financial stress, the relief of potentially solving his immediate problems was overwhelming. He signed the contract that afternoon. 2 weeks later, Marcus watched from his porch as a convoy of vehicles arrived on his property. There were several trucks loaded with equipment and supplies, a mobile office trailer, and 2 passenger buses. The efficiency of the operation was impressive. Within hours, crews were surveying land, marking boundaries, and beginning to establish what looked like a professional agricultural setup. David Kowalski supervised the initial operations personally, ensuring that Marcus was comfortable with how things were proceeding. The crews worked with obvious experience and organization, quickly establishing irrigation systems and preparing soil for planting. "How many workers will be involved in the operation?" Marcus asked as they watched the setup process. "It varies depending on the stage of production, but typically between 40 and 60 individuals during peak periods." Kowalski made notes on a clipboard. "They'll be housed in temporary facilities we establish on the far eastern section of your property, well away from your residence." Marcus was relieved to hear this. While he had agreed to the arrangement, he preferred to maintain some separation between his personal living space and the commercial operation. The workers arrived the following week. From a distance, Marcus could see them moving between the newly established growing areas, tending to crops that seemed to be thriving despite the challenging regional conditions. The irrigation systems Meridian had installed were clearly more sophisticated than anything Marcus had used for his cattle operations. For the first month, everything proceeded exactly as promised. Marcus received his rental payments on schedule, and the agricultural operation appeared to be running smoothly. The financial pressure that had dominated his life for over a year began to ease. He was able to bring his accounts current, repair equipment, and even begin planning for restoring his cattle operation when the lease expired. But success built on someone else's foundation often reveals cracks that weren't visible from the surface. It was during the second month of operations that Marcus first noticed something that didn't align with his expectations. While driving to check on his remaining cattle in the northern pastures, he passed close enough to the Meridian operation to observe the workers more closely than he had previously. Among the adults working in the fields, Marcus saw what appeared to be several individuals who looked considerably younger than he had expected. Agricultural work often involved family operations where older teenagers might work alongside adults, but some of these workers appeared to be significantly younger, possibly children. Initially, Marcus tried to rationalize what he had observed. Many agricultural communities included families where children helped with farming operations. It was possible that these were family members of adult workers, learning agricultural skills under proper supervision. But something about the organization of the work, the separation of these younger individuals from the adult workers, and the intensity of their labor made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. The doubt that began as a small concern grew larger each time he observed the operations. The morning that changed everything was a Thursday in early November. Marcus had been checking fence lines in the area where his property bordered the Meridian. Operation, when he heard shouting coming from the direction of the work site. Following the sound, he discovered a young boy sitting beside one of the irrigation ditches, holding his arm and crying. The boy appeared to be no more than 12 years old, with dark hair and clothes that were too large for his small frame. He had obviously been injured while working, and there were no adult supervisors immediately visible in the area. Marcus approached carefully, not wanting to frighten the child further. "Hey there, are you okay? What happened to your arm?" The boy looked up with wide, frightened eyes. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented, but Marcus could understand him clearly. "I fell from the ladder. My arm hurts very much." "Let me take a look," Marcus said gently, kneeling beside the boy. It was immediately apparent that the child's arm was likely broken. It was swollen and positioned at an unnatural angle. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked. "Miguel," the boy replied, tears streaming down his face. "Please don't tell them I stopped working. They will be very angry." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fear in Miguel's voice was unmistakable, and it had nothing to do with his injury. This was a child who was terrified of the consequences of not working, which meant he wasn't here by choice or as part of a family operation learning agricultural skills. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as the full implications of what he was witnessing became clear. This wasn't a legitimate agricultural operation employing adult workers. This was something far darker, and he had unknowingly provided the land where it was happening. "Miguel, I'm going to help you get medical attention for your arm, okay? And I promise nobody is going to be angry with you for being hurt." As Marcus carefully helped the injured boy to his truck, he realized that his financial problems were about to become the least of his concerns. What he had discovered on his own property was going to require actions that would likely destroy any chance of saving his ranch. But some things were more important than land, and protecting children was definitely one of them. The decision Marcus made in that moment, driving an injured 12-year-old boy toward town for medical care, would ultimately expose a network of exploitation that reached much further than his ranch in Colorado and would change the lives of dozens of children who had been trapped in circumstances they had no power to escape. But first, he had to figure out how to help Miguel without alerting the people who had been exploiting him that their operation had been discovered. The emergency room at Fairfield General Hospital buzzed with typical afternoon activity when Marcus Wheeler walked through the automatic doors carrying Miguel Rodriguez. The boy's arm had swollen considerably during the 20-minute drive from the ranch, and his face had taken on a greyish pallor that made Marcus's stomach clench with worry. Dr. Patricia Chen, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, took one look at Miguel's arm and immediately called for X-rays. As she examined the injury, she asked routine questions that Marcus found increasingly difficult to answer. "Is this your son, Mr. Wheeler?" Dr. Chen inquired while gently probing Miguel's arm. "No, he works on my property," Marcus replied, the words feeling strange and inadequate. "And where are his parents? We'll need parental consent for treatment." Marcus looked down at Miguel, who had remained silent since their arrival. The boy's eyes held a mixture of pain and fear that went far beyond his physical injury. "I'm not sure where his parents are. This is an emergency situation." Dr. Chen nodded professionally, but Marcus caught the slight furrow in her brow. In small towns like Fairfield, unusual situations involving children often raised immediate concerns. While Miguel was taken for X-rays, Marcus found himself alone in the waiting area with his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's terror when he mentioned that supervisors would be angry about him stopping work. No legitimate employer would instill that kind of fear in a child, especially not over an injury that clearly required medical attention. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen returned with the X-ray results and a social worker named Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who introduced herself with professional warmth that barely concealed her suspicion. "Miguel has a compound fracture of his radius," Dr. Chen explained. "We can treat it, but he'll need surgery to properly align the bone. Ms. Walsh has some questions about Miguel's situation." Jennifer Walsh sat across from Marcus in the small consultation room, her notepad ready. "Mr. Wheeler, can you tell me more about how Miguel came to be working on your property?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation, but he realized that honesty was his only viable option. He explained the financial pressures that had led him to lease land to Meridian Agricultural Solutions, his assumptions about the nature of their operations, and his growing concerns about what he had observed. "So you're saying you weren't aware that children were being used as laborers on your property?" Walsh asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "I had no idea. The contract mentioned agricultural workers, and I assumed they were adults. I kept my distance from the operations intentionally." Marcus ran his hands through his hair. "When I saw Miguel today, injured and terrified, I realized something was very wrong." Walsh made several notes before continuing. "Miguel has been reluctant to provide information about his situation. He seems frightened of discussing how he came to be working in your fields." "Can I talk to him?" Marcus asked. "You can try, but we need to be careful not to further traumatize him." When they returned to Miguel's room, the boy was lying in a hospital bed with his arm properly immobilized. The pain medication had helped, but his eyes still held that haunted quality that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Miguel, this is Ms. Walsh. She's here to help you," Marcus said gently, sitting beside the bed. "You're safe now, and nobody's going to hurt you for talking to us." Miguel looked between Marcus and Jennifer Walsh before speaking in a small voice. "Are you going to send me back to them?" "No, son. Nobody's going to send you back to anyone who hurt you," Marcus assured him. Over the next hour, Miguel's story emerged in fragments. He had been brought from a small town in Guatemala 6 months earlier with promises that he would attend school in America while earning money to send home to his family. Instead, he had been transported to various agricultural sites across 3 states, working in fields from dawn until dark under the supervision of men who threatened violence if the children didn't meet daily quotas. "There are others like you?" Walsh asked gently. Miguel nodded. "Many others. Some are younger than me. Elena is only 10, and she gets sick often, but they make her work anyway." Jennifer Walsh exchanged glances with Marcus. What they were dealing with wasn't just child labor. It was human trafficking on a significant scale. Miguel, we're going to need your help to make sure those other children are safe too, Walsh explained. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe where you can rest and recover. As Miguel was prepared for surgery, Marcus found himself in the hospital corridor, making the most difficult phone call of his life. He dialed the number for the FBI field office in Denver, knowing that what he was about to report would likely destroy any chance of saving his ranch, but understanding that some things were more important than property. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison arrived at the hospital 3 hours later. A woman in her late 30s, with auburn hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious crimes, she listened to Marcus's account with the focused attention of a professional investigator. Mr. Wheeler, I need you to understand that you're potentially looking at criminal charges for harboring illegal workers, even if you claim ignorance of their age and circumstances, Morrison said bluntly. I understand that, Marcus replied, but right now, my main concern is making sure those kids are safe. Good, because we're going to need your cooperation to document what's happening on your property and identify everyone involved in this operation. Agent Morrison explained that the FBI had been investigating Meridian Agricultural Solutions for several months as part of a larger probe into human trafficking operations throughout the agricultural industry. Marcus's report provided the breakthrough they needed to move forward with arrests and rescue operations. We'll need you to return to your ranch and act as if nothing has changed, Morrison instructed. We're going to place surveillance equipment on your property and document the full scope of the operation before we move in. What about Miguel? They'll notice he's missing. We'll handle that. For now, Miguel will be placed in protective custody while he recovers. If anyone asks, you can say he was taken to the hospital for treatment and hasn't returned yet. The next morning, Marcus drove back to his ranch with a small recording device concealed in his jacket and instructions to observe and document everything he could about the Meridian operation without arousing suspicion. The weight of what he was about to undertake pressed down on him like a physical burden. David Kowalski was waiting at Marcus's house when he arrived, his usual professional demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. Mr. Wheeler, we had an incident yesterday involving one of our workers. A young man was injured and apparently left the work site. Do you know anything about this? Marcus forced himself to appear calm. I saw someone had been hurt near the irrigation ditch. I took him to the hospital in town. You should have contacted me immediately, Kowalski said, his voice carrying an edge that Marcus hadn't heard before. Our workers have specific medical arrangements. Taking him to a public hospital creates complications. The kid had a broken arm. I wasn't going to let him suffer while looking for the proper paperwork. Kowalski studied Marcus's face carefully. Where is he now? Still at the hospital, as far as I know. The doctor said he needed surgery. We'll handle his medical care from here. In the future, please contact me immediately if there are any issues with our workers. After Kowalski left, Marcus spent the afternoon observing the Meridian operation from various vantage points on his property. What he saw through the lens of his new understanding was devastating. Children who couldn't have been older than 14 were working alongside adults in conditions that were clearly exploitative. They worked longer hours than the adults were, given fewer breaks, and were supervised by men who carried themselves with the authority of guards rather than foremen. That evening, Marcus met with Agent Morrison and her team at a location off his property. The surveillance equipment they had installed was already providing valuable intelligence about the scope of the operation. We've identified at least 18 children working in the fields, Morrison reported. Ages appear to range from 10 to 16. The adult supervisors are armed, and we've observed what appears to be locked housing facilities where the workers are kept at night. Locked housing? Marcus asked. The workers aren't free to leave. This isn't just illegal employment. It's forced labor. The children are being held against their will and compelled to work under threat of violence. The agent showed Marcus photographs taken by surveillance cameras. The images revealed a systematic operation designed to extract maximum labor from vulnerable children while keeping them isolated and controlled. "How long before you can shut this down?" Marcus asked. "We need more evidence to ensure we can prosecute everyone involved, not just the immediate supervisors." Meridian Agricultural Solutions appears to be part of a larger network operating across multiple states. If we move too quickly on your ranch, we might lose the opportunity to dismantle the entire organization. Marcus understood the logic, but the idea of those children working another day under those conditions made him physically ill. Over the following week, Marcus documented everything he observed while trying to maintain the appearance of a cooperative landlord. The recording device captured conversations between supervisors discussing quotas, discipline measures, and arrangements for moving workers between different locations. The breakthrough came when Marcus overheard David Kowalski on a phone call, discussing plans to relocate the entire operation to a site in Nebraska within the next 10 days. The children would be moved to a new location where Marcus would have no ability to help them. That night, Marcus called Agent Morrison with the information. "They're planning to move the kids. We can't wait any longer." "We'll be ready to move tomorrow morning," Morrison assured him. "Mr. Wheeler, I want you to understand that once we execute this operation, your involvement will become public knowledge. There may be community backlash, and you'll likely face legal and financial consequences." Marcus looked out his kitchen window toward the fields where children were being held against their will and forced to work in conditions that violated every principle he believed in. His ranch, his family's legacy, his financial future. None of it mattered compared to the lives of those kids. "I understand," he said. "Let's bring them home." The rescue operation was scheduled for dawn, and Marcus spent his last night as an unwitting participant in human trafficking, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. He thought about Miguel, hopefully safe and recovering in protective custody, and about Elena, the 10-year-old girl who was somewhere in those locked buildings, probably scared and wondering if anyone cared enough to help her. Marcus Wheeler had started this journey trying to save his ranch. Now he was about to lose everything he owned in order to save children he barely knew. But as he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, he realized that for the first time in months, he felt like the man his grandfather would have been proud of. The first helicopter appeared over Marcus Wheeler's ranch at exactly 5:47 a.m., its rotors cutting through the pre-dawn silence like thunder. From his kitchen window, Marcus watched as federal agents in tactical gear rappelled onto his property while additional vehicles surrounded the Meridian Agricultural Solutions compound from every direction. Agent Rebecca Morrison's voice crackled through the radio earpiece Marcus had been given. "Stay in your house until we give the all clear. This could get complicated quickly." Marcus had expected the rescue operation to be swift and efficient, but what unfolded over the next 4 hours was a complex extraction that revealed the true sophistication of the trafficking network operating on his land. The first challenge came when agents discovered that the housing facilities weren't just locked, they were fortified. The buildings where the children were kept contained reinforced doors, barred windows, and what appeared to be a sophisticated alarm system designed to alert supervisors to any escape attempts. "We've got a problem," Morrison's voice reported through the radio. "The subjects appear to have been moved during the night. The buildings are empty except for personal belongings." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Had Kowalski suspected something? Had the operation been compromised? 20 minutes later, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the adult workers, a man named Carlos Mendez, approached the federal agents voluntarily. He had been working at the site for 3 months and had become increasingly disturbed by the treatment of the children. "They moved the kids at midnight," Mendez told Agent Morrison in accented English. "Kowalski got a phone call yesterday evening, and within 2 hours they were loading buses. But I know where they took them." Mendez explained that Meridian operated a network of sites across Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. When law enforcement pressure increased at one location, children were rapidly relocated to other facilities. The operation Marcus had discovered was just one node in a much larger system. "There's a processing facility about 60 miles north of here, near Sterling," Mendez continued. "That's where they take kids when a site gets compromised. They'll be held there while the organization decides whether to move them out of state or dispose of the evidence." The phrase "dispose of the evidence" sent a chill through everyone present. These weren't just labor violations. They were dealing with people who viewed children as expendable commodities. Agent Morrison immediately coordinated with law enforcement agencies across 3 states, while Marcus found himself in the surreal position of riding along in a federal convoy racing toward Sterling, Colorado. His ranch, the place he had fought so desperately to save, was now a crime scene swarming with investigators. The Sterling facility was located in an industrial complex that appeared to be a legitimate food processing plant. From the outside, it looked like dozens of similar businesses that dotted the agricultural regions of eastern Colorado. But satellite surveillance revealed unusual security measures and housing structures that didn't match the facility's supposed purpose. "This is going to be more complicated than the ranch operation," Morrison explained to Marcus as they observed the facility from a distance. "This appears to be a central hub for their entire regional network. We're looking at potentially hundreds of victims, not just the children from your property." The rescue operation at Sterling required coordination between the FBI, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, local law enforcement, and Child Protective Services from 3 states. Marcus watched from a command vehicle as teams positioned themselves around the facility, knowing that somewhere inside that complex were Miguel's friends, children who had been working in his fields just hours earlier. At 2:15 p.m., the operation began. Unlike the dawn raid at Marcus's ranch, this rescue involved negotiation. The facility's operators were better organized and more sophisticated than the field supervisors, and they had legal representation on site within minutes of the federal agents' arrival. But the evidence was overwhelming. When agents finally gained access to the facility, they discovered not just the 18 children from Marcus's ranch, but 63 additional victims ranging in age from 8 to 17. The children were housed in dormitory-style buildings with locked doors and minimal sanitation facilities. Marcus was allowed into the facility after the initial security sweep, accompanying social workers who were beginning the process of interviewing and documenting each child's situation. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. Children were malnourished, exhausted, and traumatized. Many bore injuries from agricultural work that had never received proper medical attention. Some of the younger ones had been working in these conditions for over a year, brought from Central and South America with promises of education and opportunity that had been lies from the beginning. In one of the dormitory rooms, Marcus found Elena, the 10-year-old girl Miguel had mentioned. She was smaller than Marcus had imagined, with large, dark eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone her age. When she saw Marcus, she recognized him from the ranch and approached hesitantly. "Are you the man who helped Miguel?" she asked in careful English. "Yes, I am. My name is Marcus. Miguel is safe now, and you're going to be safe too," Elena nodded solemnly, then said something that broke Marcus's heart. "Will we have to work in the fields tomorrow?" "No, sweetheart. You'll never have to work in those fields again." The process of documenting each child's situation and arranging appropriate care took the remainder of the day. Marcus learned that the children came from 6 different countries, and many had been trafficked through multiple states before ending up in Colorado. Some had been promised jobs that would allow them to send money home to their families. Others had been essentially sold by desperate relatives who believed they were providing opportunities for education in America. Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatrician specializing in trauma, examined each child and briefed Marcus on their conditions. "These children have been systematically exploited for months or years. The physical injuries are significant, but the psychological trauma will require long-term treatment. Many of them don't trust adults and have been conditioned to believe that resistance results in punishment." As evening approached, Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both a witness to the rescue and a defendant in the criminal case. Federal prosecutors were still determining what charges he might face for his unwitting participation in the trafficking operation. "The fact that you cooperated fully and initiated the investigation works in your favor," explained Assistant U.S. Attorney Diana Chang, a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in human trafficking cases. "But you did sign a contract that facilitated this operation, and ignorance isn't necessarily a complete defense." Marcus understood the legal complexities, but his primary concern remained the welfare of the children. "What happens to them now?" "It's complicated," Chang admitted. "Some may be eligible for special visas that allow trafficking victims to remain in the United States. Others may be returned to their home countries if we can ensure their safety. All of them will need extensive medical care, counseling, and education to recover from what they've experienced." That evening, Marcus returned to his ranch to find it transformed into a crime scene. Evidence teams were still processing the agricultural areas, documenting the working conditions, and collecting physical evidence of the trafficking operation. His property, which had been in his family for 3 generations, was now associated with one of the largest child trafficking cases in Colorado history. The media attention began the next morning. News vans lined the road leading to Marcus's ranch, and reporters sought interviews about his role in exposing the trafficking network. The story made national headlines: "Colorado Rancher Exposes Massive Child Labor Trafficking Ring." Public reaction was mixed. Some praised Marcus for his cooperation with law enforcement and his efforts to protect the children once he discovered their situation. Others questioned how he could have been unaware of what was happening on his own property. The scrutiny was intense and often painful. Marcus's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, legal representatives, and curiosity seekers. He disconnected his landline and stopped answering his cell phone, but the attention was relentless. 3 days after the rescue operation, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Miguel Rodriguez, accompanied by his caseworker Jennifer Walsh, arrived at the ranch in the afternoon. Miguel's arm was in a cast, but he looked healthier than when Marcus had last seen him. The terror had faded from his eyes, replaced by something that might eventually become hope. "Miguel wanted to see you," Walsh explained. "He's been asking about you every day since the rescue." "How are you feeling, son?" Marcus asked, kneeling to be at eye level with the boy. "Better. The doctors are nice and the food is good. Jennifer says I might be able to go to a real school soon. That's wonderful. You're a smart kid, and education will give you opportunities to do anything you want with your life." Miguel was quiet for a moment before asking, "Will you get in trouble because of us?" The question revealed the depth of the boy's concern for others, even after everything he had endured. "Don't worry about me, Miguel. The most important thing is that you and the other kids are safe now. Elena asks about you too. She says you promised we wouldn't have to work in the fields anymore. That's right. None of you will ever have to work like that again. As Miguel and his caseworker prepared to leave, the boy turned back to Marcus. Thank you for helping us. Elena and the others, they know you're a good man. After they left, Marcus sat on his porch, looking out over his property. The agricultural equipment installed by Meridian had been removed as evidence, leaving behind only the irrigation systems and the knowledge of what had happened in those fields. His phone rang, and for once Marcus answered it. The caller was his wife, Sarah. "I saw the news," she said quietly. "Are you okay?" "I'm not sure," Marcus replied honestly. "Everything has changed. The girls are asking about you. They're proud of what you did, Marcus. So am I." It was the first conversation Marcus had had with his wife in months that didn't involve lawyers or financial arrangements. For a moment he allowed himself to hope that maybe some good could come from this tragedy. "Sarah, I might lose the ranch. The legal bills alone could bankrupt us, and the publicity has made it impossible to operate normally." "Maybe losing the ranch isn't the worst thing that could happen," she said softly. "Maybe finding out who you really are when it matters most is worth more than any piece of land." That night, Marcus walked through his empty house, thinking about Sarah's words. He had started this ordeal trying to save his family's legacy, but perhaps the real legacy wasn't the land itself. It was having the courage to do what was right when children's lives were at stake. The criminal investigation was far from over. The trafficking network extended across multiple states and involved dozens of individuals. Marcus would likely spend months testifying in various trials and legal proceedings. His financial future remained uncertain, and the media attention showed no signs of abating. But as he prepared for bed in his quiet house, Marcus realized that for the first time in years, he felt genuinely proud of who he was. The man his grandfather had raised him to be wouldn't have hesitated to protect those children, regardless of the personal cost. Sometimes the most important victories came at the highest price, and sometimes saving what mattered most meant letting go of everything else. 6 weeks after the rescue operation, Marcus Wheeler stood in a Denver courthouse wearing the only suit he owned, facing federal charges that could result in 20 years in prison. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victim advocates, and representatives from organizations that worked with trafficking survivors. The case had become a symbol of the hidden exploitation that existed within American agriculture. Assistant U.S. Attorney Diana Chang had offered Marcus a plea agreement, plead guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to harbor undocumented workers in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with ongoing investigations. His court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Robert Kim, strongly advised him to accept the deal. "The evidence shows you signed the contract and received payments," Kim explained during their final meeting before the hearing. "Even though you weren't aware of the trafficking, the prosecution can argue that reasonable due diligence would have revealed the true nature of the operation." Marcus understood the legal reality, but accepting the plea felt like admitting guilt for crimes that violated everything he believed in. "What happens if I don't take the plea?" "Then we go to trial, and you risk facing the full range of charges: conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering. The prosecution has built a comprehensive case against everyone involved in this network." The hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m., but events took an unexpected turn when Agent Rebecca Morrison approached Marcus in the courthouse hallway 30 minutes before his appearance. "Mr. Wheeler, we need to talk. Something significant has developed in the investigation." Morrison led Marcus to a private conference room where several other federal agents were waiting, along with Diana Chang and a man Marcus didn't recognize. A thin, nervous individual in his 50s wearing an expensive suit. "This is Thomas Brennan," Morrison explained. He's the CEO of Meridian Agricultural Solutions, and he's decided to cooperate with our investigation. Brennan looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone whose world had collapsed around him. Mr. Wheeler, I want you to know that the trafficking operation wasn't supposed to be part of our business model. It was never authorized by our corporate leadership. What are you saying? Marcus asked, confused. Diana Chang stepped forward with a thick folder of documents. Mr. Brennan has provided evidence that Meridian Agricultural Solutions was infiltrated by criminal organizations that were using the company's legitimate operations as cover for trafficking activities. The field supervisors who were running the operation on your ranch were working for a separate criminal network. Marcus felt his head spinning. So Meridian itself wasn't involved. The corporate entity was involved, but not intentionally, Morrison clarified. Brennan's investigation of his own company revealed that several regional managers had been compromised or were working directly for trafficking organizations. They were using Meridian's contracts and infrastructure to facilitate their operations. Brennan opened a laptop and showed Marcus financial records that revealed a complex web of payments and transactions. My company has been under investigation by the FBI for 8 months. When we discovered what was happening, we immediately began cooperating with law enforcement. The operation on your ranch was one of 12 similar sites across 4 states. The implications were staggering. Marcus had unknowingly become part of a criminal enterprise that was much larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. This changes the charges against you significantly, Diana Chang explained. Instead of being a co-conspirator, you're now classified as a victim of fraud. The plea agreement is off the table because we don't believe you committed the crimes we originally charged you with. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the federal agents explained how the investigation had evolved. The trafficking network had been operating for over 3 years, generating millions of dollars in profits by exploiting children and adults throughout the agricultural regions of the western United States. What does this mean for my legal situation? Marcus asked. All federal charges against you are being dropped, Chang announced. However, you'll still be required to testify in the trials of the actual perpetrators. Your cooperation has been invaluable in building cases against the people who were really responsible for this operation. The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that his ordeal was far from over. The civil lawsuits, media attention, and community scrutiny would continue regardless of the federal charges. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with Jennifer Walsh, the social worker who had been coordinating care for the rescued children. She had requested the meeting to update him on the progress of the kids he had helped save. Miguel is doing remarkably well, Walsh reported as they sat in her office at the Department of Social Services. He's been placed with a foster family in Colorado Springs, and he's already enrolled in school. His English is improving rapidly, and his arm has healed completely. What about Elena and the others? Elena has been more challenging. She's younger and was trafficked for a longer period, so her trauma is more severe. She's with a specialized foster family that works specifically with trafficking victims. She's making progress, but it's going to be a long process. Walsh showed Marcus photographs of some of the children in their new placements. Seeing them in clean clothes, well-fed, and attending school provided Marcus with the first genuine happiness he'd experienced since this entire ordeal began. 17 of the children have been granted T visas, which allow trafficking victims to remain in the United States, Walsh continued. They'll be eligible for permanent residency after 3 years if they continue cooperating with law enforcement. And the others? Some have been reunited with family members in their home countries, but only after extensive investigation to ensure they wouldn't be re-trafficked. A few are still in legal limbo, while we determine the safest placement for them. Walsh handed Marcus a letter written in careful cursive handwriting. "This is from Miguel. He wanted me to give it to you." The letter was brief but profoundly moving. "Dear Mr. Marcus, thank you for saving us from the bad place. I am in school now and learning many things. My foster parents are kind, and they say I can stay with them as long as I need. I want to study hard so I can help other children like Elena and me. Jennifer says you might go to prison because you helped us, but I hope that doesn't happen because you are a good man." Your friend, Miguel Rodriguez Marcus, had to step outside Walsh's office to compose himself after reading Miguel's letter. The boy's concern for his welfare, after everything he had endured, was a reminder of the resilience and humanity that no amount of exploitation could destroy. That evening, Marcus drove back to his ranch for the first time since the federal charges had been dropped. The property looked different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because he saw it through the lens of everything that had happened there. His neighbor, Bill Hutchinson, was waiting by the gate when Marcus arrived. Hutchinson had been ranching in the area for over 40 years, and his opinion carried significant weight in the local community. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," Hutchinson said without preamble. "A lot of us were quick to judge when this story first broke. We thought you were either involved or negligent, but after seeing what really happened and how you handled it, I want you to know that you've got support in this community." "I appreciate that, Bill. It's been a difficult time." "There's something else. A group of us have been talking, and we want to help you get back on your feet. The Grange Association is organizing a fundraiser to help cover your legal expenses and get your cattle operation running again." Marcus was speechless. He had expected ostracism from his neighbors, not support. "You don't have to do that," he managed to say. "Yes, we do. What you did took courage, and that's the kind of neighbor we want in this community. Besides, this trafficking thing could have happened to any of us. We all face the same financial pressures you were dealing with." Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that community support extended far beyond his immediate neighbors. The story of the rancher who sacrificed his financial security to protect trafficked children had resonated with people across the country. Donations began arriving from unexpected sources: churches, school groups, and individuals who had been moved by the media coverage. Marcus used the donations to establish the Wheeler Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of child trafficking. Rather than simply rebuilding his cattle operation, he decided to transform his ranch into something that could make a lasting difference. The foundation's first project was converting part of his property into a therapeutic ranch where trafficking survivors could experience the healing power of working with animals and land in a safe, supportive environment. Dr. Patricia Chen, the emergency room physician who had first treated Miguel, joined the foundation's board and helped design programs that combined medical care, education, and agricultural therapy. Miguel was among the first participants in the Therapeutic Ranch program. On a warm Saturday in April, Marcus watched as the boy, who had once been terrified of fieldwork, carefully tended to a small vegetable garden he had planted himself. "It's different when you choose to do it," Miguel explained as he watered tomato seedlings. "Before, I was scared all the time. Now, I like making things grow." Elena, too, had begun participating in the program. At 11 years old, she was still recovering from her trauma, but she had developed a special bond with the horses that the foundation kept for therapeutic riding sessions. "She doesn't talk much yet," her therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, explained to Marcus, "but she's making remarkable progress." The combination of a stable environment, consistent care, and the opportunity to nurture other living things is helping her rebuild her sense of agency and self-worth. The transformation wasn't limited to the children. Marcus found that his work with trafficking survivors had given him a sense of purpose that went far beyond anything he had experienced as a traditional rancher. The financial security he had once desperately sought seemed less important than the knowledge that his property was now being used to heal rather than exploit. Sarah returned to the ranch in May, bringing their daughters for an extended visit. The media attention had largely died down, and the family was finally able to have private conversations about their future. "I'm proud of what you've built here," Sarah said, as they walked through the therapeutic gardens where several young trafficking survivors were learning agricultural skills in a supportive environment. "This is more important than anything we lost." "Are you thinking about coming home?" Marcus asked, not wanting to pressure her but hoping the answer would be yes. "I think we all are. The girls want to be involved in the Foundation's work, and I've been offered a position with the state's anti-trafficking task force. It feels like we could build something meaningful together." That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset over land that was now dedicated to healing rather than production, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He'd set out to save a ranch and had ended up saving children. He had lost his financial security, but found his moral purpose. He had faced the possibility of prison, but discovered the support of his community. The Wheeler Ranch would never again be a traditional cattle operation, but it had become something far more significant, a place where broken lives could be rebuilt, where exploitation could be transformed into empowerment, and where one man's decision to do the right thing had created ripples of positive change that would continue for generations. As darkness settled over the Colorado plains, Marcus could hear the laughter of children who were no longer afraid, and he knew that some victories were worth any price. 2 years after the rescue operation that changed everything, Marcus Wheeler stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado, Denver, delivering a keynote address to law enforcement officials, social workers, and anti-trafficking advocates from across the western United States. The annual conference on combating human trafficking had invited him to share insights from his unique perspective as someone who had unwittingly facilitated trafficking before becoming one of the most effective advocates for survivors. "The most dangerous assumption we can make is that trafficking only happens in places we can easily identify," Marcus told the audience. "It happens in suburban neighborhoods, on family farms, in businesses that appear completely legitimate. The signs are often subtle, and the perpetrators are skilled at hiding their operations within normal economic activities." In the 2 years since establishing the Wheeler Foundation, Marcus had become an unexpected expert on agricultural trafficking networks. His testimony had been instrumental in prosecuting 17 individuals across 4 states, and his foundation had provided support to over 60 trafficking survivors. The Wheeler Ranch now bore little resemblance to the struggling cattle operation it had once been. The property had been transformed into a comprehensive facility that included therapeutic housing for survivors, educational programs, counseling services, and job training initiatives designed specifically for young people recovering from trafficking. Experiences. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, had joined the foundation as its clinical director 18 months earlier. Her research on the effectiveness of agricultural therapy for trafficking survivors was gaining national attention and had attracted federal funding that allowed the program to expand significantly. "What we've discovered is that many trafficking survivors have been denied the opportunity to make choices about their own lives for extended periods," Dr. Vasquez explained to Marcus during their weekly program review meeting. "The act of planting seeds, caring for animals, and seeing the results of their nurturing behavior helps rebuild their sense of agency and self-efficacy." The Foundation's success stories were remarkable. Miguel Rodriguez, now 15, had not only recovered from his physical and psychological trauma, but had become a peer counselor for newly rescued children. His English was fluent, and he maintained excellent grades while attending high school. In Colorado Springs, his foster family had begun adoption proceedings, giving him the permanent stability he needed to thrive. Elena, now 13, had made dramatic progress in her recovery. The frightened 10-year-old, who had once asked if she would have to work in the fields the next day, had become a confident young woman who was passionate about horse care and was considering veterinary medicine as a career path. But the Foundation's most ambitious project was just beginning. Marcus had partnered with the Colorado Department of Agriculture to establish a certification program for agricultural businesses that wanted to demonstrate their commitment to ethical labor practices. The Verified Safe Agriculture program would provide independent monitoring and certification for farms and agricultural operations, helping consumers identify businesses that maintained legitimate employment practices. The program had attracted the attention of major grocery chains and restaurant companies that wanted to ensure their supply chains were free from trafficking. Within 6 months of its launch, over 300 agricultural businesses across Colorado had applied for certification. However, Marcus's work had also made him enemies. The criminal networks that had been disrupted by his cooperation with law enforcement viewed him as a significant threat to their operations. Agent Rebecca Morrison, who had maintained contact with Marcus throughout the investigation and prosecution phases, warned him that intelligence indicated several trafficking organizations had identified him as a target. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that some of the people you helped put in prison have associates who blame you for the collapse of their regional operations," Morrison explained during a security briefing at the Foundation's offices. "We recommend enhanced security measures for your property and family." The threat was serious enough that the FBI installed a security system at the Wheeler Ranch and provided training for Marcus and his staff on recognizing and responding to potential security issues. Sarah, who had returned to the ranch with their daughters the previous year, struggled with the reality that their advocacy work had put their family at risk. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished," she told Marcus during a difficult conversation about their security situation. "But I need to know that our girls are safe. They're 15 and 17 now. They understand what we're doing and why. It matters, but they shouldn't have to live in fear because of it." Marcus understood Sarah's concerns, but he also knew that backing down from the Foundation's work would mean abandoning dozens of survivors who depended on their programs. The solution came from an unexpected source. The local community had rallied around the Wheeler family, to such an extent that the ranch was rarely without visitors, volunteers, or staff members who could serve as additional eyes and ears for security purposes. The Foundation's annual fundraising gala in September attracted over 400 attendees, including state legislators, business leaders, and survivors who had successfully completed the program. The event raised over $200,000 for program expansion, but more importantly, it demonstrated the broad community support for the Foundation's mission. Miguel was the evening's keynote speaker, delivering a speech that brought many audience members to tears. His transformation from a terrified 12-year-old to a confident teenager advocating for other survivors was a powerful testament to the effectiveness of the Foundation's approach. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over, Miguel told the audience. I believed that I would spend my childhood working in fields, afraid and alone. Mr. Marcus and the people at this foundation didn't just save my life, they gave me back my future. Now, I want to help other kids find their futures. 2. After Miguel's speech, Marcus was approached by a woman he didn't recognize, Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a professor of social work at Denver University who had been studying the Foundation's programs. "Mr. Wheeler, I've been documenting the outcomes for survivors who have participated in your programs, and the results are extraordinary," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The recidivism rate for trafficking among your program graduates is 0. Every survivor who has completed your program has either continued their education, entered legitimate employment, or started their own businesses." The statistics were impressive, but Marcus was more interested in the individual stories. Carlos Mendez, the adult worker who had initially provided information about the Sterling facility, had become the Foundation's agricultural supervisor. His knowledge of farming combined with his understanding of exploitation made him uniquely qualified to teach survivors how agricultural work could be empowering rather than exploitative. Rosa Delgado, a 16-year-old who had been trafficked for 3 years before being rescued from a different operation, had completed her GED through the Foundation's education program and was now attending community college with plans to become a social worker. James Park, a 14-year-old from South Korea who had been trafficked through a different network, had discovered a talent for welding and was apprenticing with a local manufacturing company that had partnered with the Foundation to provide job training opportunities. The Foundation's success had attracted national attention. Marcus found himself testifying before congressional committees about agricultural trafficking and consulting with other states that wanted to establish similar programs. The model developed at the Wheeler Ranch was being replicated in Texas, California, and Nebraska. But perhaps the most significant development came in October when the Department of Justice announced that the multi-state investigation that had begun with Miguel's rescue had resulted in the conviction of 127 individuals and the rescue of over 400 trafficking victims. The network that had operated on Marcus's ranch had been completely dismantled, and the intelligence gathered during the investigation had led to successful prosecutions across 6 states. This investigation represents one of the most successful anti-trafficking operations in the history of federal law enforcement, announced Attorney General Lisa Thompson during a press conference in Denver. The cooperation of individuals like Marcus Wheeler, who was willing to sacrifice his own financial interests to protect victims, was essential to achieving these results. The press conference was held at the Wheeler Ranch, with many of the rescued children and adults participating as a demonstration of the recovery program's effectiveness. Miguel and Elena both spoke to reporters about their experiences and their hopes for the future. Standing in the same fields where children had once been exploited, surrounded by survivors who were now thriving, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed his ranch seemed like a lifetime ago. The man who had been desperate enough to lease his land to unknown companies without proper investigation had been replaced by someone who understood that true security came from doing work that mattered. As the press conference concluded, and the reporters departed, Marcus walked through the therapeutic gardens where several current program participants were tending to fall vegetables. The autumn harvest was abundant, and the children working in the gardens moved with confidence and purpose that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Sarah joined him as he watched the survivors work. Their daughters, now 17 and 19, were home from school and college respectively, both actively involved in the Foundation's mentorship programs. "Do you ever miss the old ranch?" Sarah asked, taking his hand as they observed the scene before them. "I miss the simplicity of it sometimes," Marcus admitted, "but I can't imagine doing anything else now. These kids have taught me more about resilience and courage than I ever learned from raising cattle." That evening, as Marcus completed his daily walk around the property, a security measure that had become a peaceful ritual, he encountered Miguel near the horse pastures. The teenager was studying under an outdoor light, working on homework from his advanced placement history class. "Planning to stay up all night with those books?" Marcus asked, sitting on the fence beside Miguel. "I want to get into a good college," Miguel replied. "I've been thinking about studying law. I want to help prosecute people who hurt kids like us." "That's a worthy goal. You'll make an excellent lawyer." Miguel closed his textbook and looked out over the ranch where he had first found safety. "Mr. Marcus, do you think we've really made a difference? I mean, there are still kids out there who are trapped like we were." It was a question Marcus had wrestled with throughout his advocacy work. The scope of human trafficking was vast, and despite their successes, countless children remained in exploitative situations. "Miguel, 2 years ago you were trapped and afraid, and now you're planning to become a lawyer who will fight trafficking. Elena is thinking about becoming a veterinarian. Rosa is studying social work. Every person we help becomes someone who can help others. The difference we make grows exponentially with each survivor who rebuilds their life. Like ripples in a pond," Miguel said thoughtfully, "exactly like ripples in a pond." As Marcus finally returned to his house, he found a message on his answering machine from Agent Morrison. New intelligence had emerged about trafficking operations in Wyoming, and law enforcement wanted his input on identifying potential signs of agricultural exploitation. Marcus smiled as he noted the callback number. 3 years ago, he had been a failing rancher whose greatest concern was making mortgage payments. Now he was part of a network of advocates, law enforcement officials, and survivors who were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that allowed trafficking to flourish. The Wheeler Ranch would never again be measured by cattle production or agricultural profits. Its success was now counted in lives rebuilt, futures restored, and a growing community of people committed to ensuring that what had happened in those fields would never happen again. And in the quiet Colorado night, that seemed like the most important legacy any ranch could leave. 5 years after Miguel Rodriguez first collapsed beside an irrigation ditch with a broken arm, Marcus Wheeler received a phone call that would test everything he had learned about fighting human trafficking. The caller was Detective Angela Torres from the Phoenix Police Department, and she was investigating a case that bore disturbing similarities to the operation that had once existed on his ranch. "Mr. Wheeler, we've uncovered what appears to be a sophisticated trafficking network operating through legitimate agricultural businesses in Arizona," Detective Torres explained during their initial conversation. "The perpetrators are using your case as a blueprint for what not to do. They've learned from the mistakes that led to the exposure of the Colorado operations." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The idea that criminals were studying his case to improve their own operations was deeply disturbing. "What exactly are you seeing? They're using smaller, more distributed sites instead of centralized operations. They're limiting the number of children at each location and rotating them frequently between states to avoid detection. They've also corrupted local officials to provide advance warning of any law enforcement activity." The Phoenix investigation had begun when a 16-year-old trafficking victim named Ana Gutierrez escaped from a tomato farm outside the city. Her story paralleled Miguel's experience in many ways, but the operation holding her was far more sophisticated and security-conscious than what Marcus had encountered. "Ana mentioned your foundation during her interview," Torres continued. "She said other children at the facility had heard about a place in Colorado where trafficking survivors could be safe and get help. She specifically asked if Miguel Rodriguez was real or just a story the kids told each other for hope." The revelation that Marcus's foundation had become a source of hope for children still trapped in trafficking situations was both inspiring and heartbreaking. It meant their work was reaching beyond the survivors they could directly help. But it also highlighted how many children remained in desperate circumstances. Detective Torres, what can I do to help? We need someone with your experience to help identify the signs we should be looking for. These operations have evolved specifically to avoid the detection methods that worked in your case. We need to evolve our approach accordingly. Within a week, Marcus was in Phoenix working with a joint task force of federal and local law enforcement agencies. The Arizona operation was significantly different from what he had encountered in Colorado. Instead of using legitimate companies that had been infiltrated by criminals, the traffickers had created an entire network of shell corporations and false documentation that made their operations appear completely legal. The farms were smaller, typically employing 15 to 20 workers instead of the 60-plus individuals who had been held at the Sterling facility. The children were moved between locations every few weeks, making it difficult for law enforcement to build cases or for the victims to form relationships that might lead to escape attempts. They've learned that the emotional bonds between victims can be dangerous to their operations, explained FBI agent Michael Chen, who was leading the federal investigation. By constantly moving children and preventing them from forming friendships, they reduce the likelihood that anyone will take risks to help others escape. Marcus spent 3 days observing the suspected facilities from a distance, drawing on his agricultural background to identify inconsistencies in the operations. What he discovered was chilling. The traffickers had studied legitimate farming practices extensively and had created operations that appeared completely normal to casual observation. The irrigation systems are more sophisticated than most family farms would install, Marcus noted during a briefing with the task force. The housing facilities are designed to look like standard agricultural worker dormitories, but notice the placement of the windows and the reinforced door frames. Ana Gutierrez, the 16-year-old who had escaped and triggered the investigation, was being held in protective custody while the case developed. Marcus asked permission to speak with her, hoping that his experience with trafficking survivors might help her feel more comfortable providing detailed information about the operations. Ana was small for her age, with the thin build and cautious demeanor that Marcus had learned to recognize in trafficking survivors. When they met in a secure interview room at the police station, her first question surprised him. "Are you really the man who saved Miguel and Elena?" "Miguel and Elena saved themselves," Marcus replied carefully. "I just happened to be in a position to help when they needed it." "Miguel really became a lawyer?" Marcus smiled. "He's in law school at the University of Colorado. He's planning to specialize in prosecuting trafficking cases. Elena is studying veterinary medicine, and she volunteers at our foundation during her breaks from college." For the first time since Marcus had entered the room, Anna's expression showed something other than fear or caution. They really made it out. They really got to have normal lives. They did. "And you will too, Anna. But first, we need your help to make sure the other kids in those facilities get the same chance." Over the following hours, Anna provided detailed information about the trafficking network that was far more sophisticated than anything Marcus had previously encountered. The children were told they were part of a legitimate work program that would eventually lead to permanent residency in the United States. They were given false documentation, basic education, and even small amounts of spending money to make. The operation appeared legitimate. The smart thing they did was make it seem like we had choices, Anna explained. We could choose what to eat from a limited menu. We could choose when to shower within designated time periods. We could choose which work assignments to take. It felt like freedom, but really everything was controlled. The psychological manipulation was far more advanced than the crude threats and physical intimidation that had characterized the Colorado operations. The traffickers had learned that providing the illusion of choice was more effective than obvious coercion at preventing escape attempts. "How did you manage to get away?" Marcus asked. "I got sick with pneumonia, and they took me to a hospital for treatment. A nurse named Patricia noticed that I was afraid to speak when the man who brought me was in the room. She called the police after he left. The nurse, Patricia Williams, had recognized signs of trafficking based on training she had received following the publicity from Marcus's case. Her intervention had not only saved Anna, but had provided law enforcement with the breakthrough they needed to identify the broader network." Working with the task force, Marcus helped develop a strategy for investigating the network that took into account its more sophisticated security measures. Instead of conducting simultaneous raids on all known facilities, law enforcement would begin with surveillance and intelligence gathering to map the complete structure of the organization. "We need to understand how they move children between locations, who their financial backers are, and how they've corrupted local officials," Agent Chen explained during a planning session. "If we move too quickly, we might rescue some victims while allowing the leadership to escape and rebuild elsewhere." The investigation required months of patient surveillance and intelligence gathering. Marcus returned to Colorado, but remained in regular contact with the Phoenix Task Force, providing insights based on his experience and helping to train law enforcement officers on identifying signs of agricultural trafficking. During this period, the Wheeler Foundation faced its own challenges. An investigative journalist named Kevin Walsh had begun questioning the foundation's finances and suggesting that Marcus was profiting from his advocacy work. The articles, published in a Denver area magazine, implied that the foundation was misusing donor funds and that Marcus's high-profile advocacy was primarily motivated by personal financial gain. "Wheeler's Foundation, Hero or Opportunist," read the headline of Walsh's most damaging article. "How a failed rancher built a personal empire on the suffering of trafficking victims." The accusations were false but professionally damaging. Several major donors suspended their contributions pending an independent audit of the foundation's finances, and Marcus found himself defending his motives and methods in media interviews and community meetings. Sarah was furious about the attacks on her husband's character. "These people have no idea what we've sacrificed to build this foundation," she told Marcus after a particularly difficult community meeting where several residents had questioned his integrity. "We could have taken the insurance money after. The ranch failed and moved somewhere else to start over. Instead, we've dedicated our lives to helping survivors." The stress of defending the foundation while continuing to work on the Phoenix investigation was enormous. Marcus found himself working 18-hour days, traveling constantly between Colorado and Arizona, and struggling to maintain the personal relationships that had sustained him through previous challenges. Miguel, now in his second year of law school, called Marcus during this difficult period. "Mr. Marcus, I've been reading about the attacks on the foundation. Is there anything I can do to help?" "Just focus on your studies, Miguel. This will pass." "No, I don't think you understand. Without the foundation, I would probably be dead or still trapped somewhere. Elena, Rosa, Carlos, all of us, we owe our lives to what you built. We're not going to let some journalist destroy it with lies." Miguel had organized a group of foundation graduates to publicly defend the organization and Marcus's character. Their testimonials, published in local newspapers and shared on social media, provided powerful counter-narratives to Walsh's accusations. Elena, now studying veterinary medicine at Colorado State University, wrote an op-ed for the Denver Post titled "The Man Who Gave Me Back My Childhood." Rosa Delgado, who had graduated from social work school and was working with trafficking survivors in Texas, flew to Colorado to speak at a community meeting defending the foundation. Marcus Wheeler didn't save us because it was profitable, Rosa told the packed auditorium. He saved us because it was right, and when we were safe, he didn't abandon us. He built a place where we could heal and grow and become the people we were meant to be. The independent audit of the foundation's finances, completed after 3 months of scrutiny, found no evidence of financial impropriety. The foundation's overhead costs were below industry standards, and Marcus's salary was modest compared to leaders of similar organizations. Kevin Walsh's subsequent retraction was much less prominently featured than his original accusations, but the damage to the foundation's reputation had been significant. During this challenging period, the Phoenix investigation finally reached its culmination. The trafficking network operated across Arizona, Nevada, and California, involving over 30 facilities and more than 200 victims. The sophistication of the operation was unprecedented. The traffickers had corrupted officials in multiple agencies, created false documentation that could pass official scrutiny, and developed financial structures that made tracking money extremely difficult. The rescue operation was planned for early December, involving coordination between federal agencies and local law enforcement across 3 states. Marcus was invited to observe the operation from the command center in Phoenix, given his role in developing the investigative strategy. This is the largest agricultural trafficking rescue operation in U.S. history, Agent Chen briefed the assembled law enforcement officials. We've identified 187 victims, including 94 children. The youngest victim is 7 years old. At 4 a.m. on December 15th, simultaneous operations began at 31 locations. Marcus watched from the command center as reports came in from teams across the southwestern United States. The sophistication of the trafficking network became apparent as the operation unfolded. Several facilities had early warning systems that allowed traffickers to attempt to move victims before law enforcement arrived. But the months of patient investigation had anticipated these tactics. Law enforcement had identified the transportation routes and staging areas used by the network, allowing them to intercept attempts to relocate victims. By noon, 184 victims had been rescued, including Ana Gutierrez, who had been moved to a facility in Nevada after her escape had compromised the Phoenix operations. 3 victims could not be located and were presumed to have been moved out of state before the operation began. The emotional toll of witnessing the rescue was enormous. Marcus watched as children, who appeared to be as young as 6 or 7, were brought to safety, many showing signs of malnutrition and untreated injuries. The victims displayed the same mixture of fear, confusion, and cautious hope that he had first seen in Miguel 5 years earlier. These children are going to need years of support to recover from what they've experienced, Dr. Elena Vasquez told Marcus as they reviewed preliminary assessments of the rescued victims. The psychological manipulation these traffickers used was far more sophisticated than anything we've encountered previously. Several of the rescued children asked about the Wheeler Foundation during their initial interviews. Word of the foundation's success had spread through the underground networks that connected trafficking victims, giving them hope that recovery was possible. "We're going to need to expand our programs significantly," Marcus told Sarah during a phone call from Phoenix. "There are almost 200 survivors who are going to need long-term support, and most existing programs don't have the capacity to handle this influx." The successful rescue operation validated the approaches Marcus had helped develop, but it also highlighted the enormous scope of the trafficking problem. The network they had dismantled was one of dozens operating throughout the United States. And the rescue of 184 victims, while significant, represented only a fraction of the children and adults trapped in similar circumstances. As Marcus prepared to return to Colorado, he reflected on how much had changed since he first discovered Miguel beside that irrigation ditch. The work had become more complex, the opposition more sophisticated, and the stakes higher than he had ever imagined. But the fundamental mission remained the same, protecting children who had no one else to protect them. The fight was far from over, but each rescued child represented a victory that could never be taken away. 7 years after Marcus Wheeler first discovered the dark truth about what was happening on his ranch, he stood in the rose garden of the White House, waiting to meet with President Catherine Morrison about a national initiative to combat human trafficking. The invitation had come through Secretary of Homeland Security David Chen, whose department had been studying the Wheeler Foundation's success rates and wanted to scale their approach nationally. The journey to Washington had been complicated by an unexpected development. Miguel Rodriguez, now 22 and in his final year of law school, had been selected as a White House intern specializing in human rights policy. His transformation from trafficking victim to policy advisor represented the kind of success story that politicians love to highlight. But Miguel's presence at the meeting added emotional weight that made Marcus nervous about maintaining his composure. "Mr. Wheeler, it's an honor to finally meet you," President Morrison said as she greeted Marcus in the Oval Office. "Miguel has told me extraordinary things about your foundation's work. I understand that every survivor who has completed your program has successfully reintegrated into society. We've been fortunate to have exceptional staff and strong community support," Marcus replied, still adjusting to the surreal experience of discussing his work in the nation's most powerful office. But the real credit belongs to the survivors themselves. They've shown remarkable courage and resilience. Miguel, dressed in a professional suit that made him look older than his 22 years, sat quietly during the initial pleasantries. But when President Morrison asked him to share his perspective on the foundation's effectiveness, his response was articulate and powerful. "Madam President, when I was 12 years old, I believed my life was over. I thought I would spend my childhood working in fields, afraid and hungry and alone. Mr. Marcus didn't just save my life, he gave me back my future. The Foundation's approach works because it treats survivors as whole human beings, not just victims who need to be managed." The meeting's purpose was to discuss the administration's proposed Safe Harbor Initiative, a comprehensive federal program designed to identify and support trafficking survivors while dismantling the networks that exploited them. The initiative would provide $500 million in funding over 5 years, with the Wheeler Foundation serving as a model for therapeutic recovery programs. "We want to establish regional centers based on your Colorado model," explained Secretary Chen, who had flown to Washington specifically for the meeting. "Centers that combine law enforcement training, survivor support services, and community education programs." Marcus was honored by the recognition, but he was also concerned about the challenges of scaling their intimate, community-based approach to a national level. "Mr. Secretary, our success has been built on personal relationships and local community support. I'm not sure those elements can be replicated through federal bureaucracy. That's exactly why we need your involvement," President Morrison responded. "We don't want to create another government program that treats symptoms while ignoring root causes. We want to support community-based solutions that actually work." The discussion continued for over an hour, covering details about funding mechanisms, oversight structures, and implementation timelines. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of advising federal policymakers on programs that would affect thousands of trafficking survivors across the country. After the White House meeting, Marcus and Miguel spent the afternoon walking through Washington, discussing the proposed initiative and its potential impact. For Marcus, seeing Miguel navigating the corridors of power with confidence and intelligence was deeply satisfying. This young man, who had once been terrified to speak, was now helping shape national policy. "Miguel, are you comfortable with being so public about your background?" Marcus asked as they sat on a bench near the Lincoln Memorial. "Once this initiative is announced, you're going to be the face of trafficking recovery for a lot of people." "I've thought about that," Miguel replied thoughtfully. "For a long time, I wanted to hide from what happened to me. But Elena helped me realize that our stories can help other kids who are still trapped. If my experience can prevent even one child from going through what we went through, then it's worth the publicity." Elena had graduated from veterinary school the previous year and was now working at a large animal practice in Fort Collins, Colorado. She had maintained her connection to the Wheeler Foundation, serving on its board and providing counseling to newly rescued children. Her recovery had been remarkable, but she had chosen to keep a lower public profile than Miguel. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Sarah. The Wheeler Foundation was facing a new crisis that required Marcus's immediate attention. "Marcus, we've got a problem," Sarah said, her voice tight with stress. "Someone broke into the Foundation's offices last night. They didn't steal anything valuable, but they accessed our client files and donor database. The break-in was clearly targeted rather than random. The intruders had bypassed expensive equipment and cash to focus specifically on confidential information about trafficking survivors and Foundation supporters. Marcus immediately suspected retaliation from criminal networks that had been disrupted by the Foundation's work. "Have you called the FBI?" Marcus asked, already planning his return to Colorado. "Agent Morrison is already here. She thinks this might be connected to the Phoenix prosecutions. Several of the defendants are facing life sentences, and their associates might be trying to intimidate witnesses." Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with knowing that his advocacy work had put others at risk. The Foundation's client files contained detailed information about survivors' backgrounds, locations, and recovery progress. Information that could be extremely dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The flight back to Colorado felt endless. Marcus spent the time reviewing security protocols and wondering if he had been naive about the level of risk his work created for the people he was trying to help. The Foundation had grown to serve over 150 survivors across 5 states, and the thought that any of them might be endangered because of his decisions was agonizing. Agent Morrison met Marcus at the Denver airport with an update that confirmed his worst fears. The break-in was definitely professional. They knew exactly what they were looking for and how to access our systems without triggering alarms. "We're treating this as a potential threat to witness safety." The Foundation's offices were now a crime scene, with FBI technicians processing evidence and security experts installing enhanced protection systems. But the immediate concern was protecting the survivors whose information had been compromised. "We're recommending temporary relocation for any survivors who are scheduled to testify in upcoming trials," Morrison explained as they drove toward the Foundation. "We're also placing additional security at the ranch and your family's residence." The security measures were necessary but disruptive. Several program participants were moved to safe houses in other states, interrupting their education and employment. The therapeutic programs that had been so effective at creating stability and normalcy were suddenly overshadowed by the reality that recovery from trafficking was never completely safe. Elena drove down from Fort Collins to help coordinate the response to the security crisis. Her presence was calming for the younger survivors who were frightened by the sudden changes to their routines. "I know this is scary," she told a group of teenage survivors during an emergency meeting at the ranch, "but remember that we're not The same people we were when we were trapped. We're stronger now, and we have people who care about us. These criminals want us to be afraid, because fear makes us easier to control." Her words carried weight, because the other survivors knew she had faced similar challenges and emerged stronger. The peer support network that had developed among Foundation graduates proved to be one of their most effective tools for managing the crisis. Carlos Mendez, who had become the Foundation's agricultural supervisor after providing crucial testimony in the original Colorado case, took charge of implementing additional security measures at the ranch. His experience with criminal networks made him valuable in identifying potential vulnerabilities. "These people think like predators," Carlos explained to Marcus as they reviewed the property's security systems. "They look for weakness, isolation, and fear. The best defense is making sure our people feel strong, connected, and supported." The investigation into the break-in revealed connections to the trafficking network that had been operating in Arizona. Several defendants facing prosecution had associates in Colorado who viewed the Wheeler Foundation as responsible for their legal troubles. "We've identified at least 3 individuals who have made specific threats against the Foundation and its staff," Agent Morrison briefed Marcus and Sarah during a security meeting. "We're tracking their movements, but we need to assume they may attempt additional intimidation tactics." The threats forced Marcus to confront questions about the sustainability of his advocacy work. The Foundation's success had made it a target, and the safety of survivors was being compromised by the very visibility that allowed the programs to attract funding and political support. "Maybe we should consider scaling back our public advocacy," Sarah suggested during a difficult family conversation. "The Foundation's programs can continue, but you don't have to be the public face of anti-trafficking efforts. If I step back..." "Now what message does that send to other potential advocates?" Marcus replied. "These criminals want us to be afraid and isolated. If we give in to intimidation, we're essentially helping them maintain their operations." The debate continued for weeks, with staff members, board members, and survivors offering different perspectives on how to balance safety with advocacy effectiveness. The decision ultimately came from an unexpected source. The survivors themselves voted to continue the Foundation's public work despite the increased risks. "We've already lost too much of our lives to fear," Rosa Delgado said during a Foundation board meeting. "If we let these people scare us into hiding, then they win. Our stories have power, and we need to keep telling them." The survivors' courage inspired a renewed commitment to the Foundation's mission, but with enhanced security measures and more careful coordination with law enforcement. The break-in had been traumatic, but it had also demonstrated the strength of the community that had developed around the Foundation's work. In January, 8 months after the White House meeting, President Morrison announced the Safe Harbor Initiative at a ceremony in Denver. The Wheeler Foundation was designated as the flagship program for the national expansion, with Marcus serving as senior advisor for the implementation. Miguel, who had graduated from law school and accepted a position with the Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, delivered remarks at the ceremony that captured the significance of the moment. "7 years ago, I was a frightened child who believed I had no future," Miguel told the assembled crowd of law enforcement officials, advocates, and survivors. "Today, I'm a federal prosecutor who will spend his career ensuring that other children don't experience what I experienced. This transformation was possible because people like Marcus Wheeler and the staff of this foundation believed that every survivor deserves not just rescue, but recovery." The ceremony was held at the Wheeler Ranch, in the same fields where Miguel had once worked under threats of violence. The symbolism was powerful. Land that had been used for exploitation had been transformed into a place of healing and hope. Standing in those fields, surrounded by survivors who had rebuilt their lives, and law enforcement officials committed to fighting trafficking. Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed his ranch 7 years earlier now seemed like a small price to pay for the opportunity to be part of something so much larger than himself. The work was far from over. Human trafficking continued to flourish in communities across America, and new networks emerged as quickly as old ones were dismantled. But the Safe Harbor Initiative represented a fundamental shift in how the federal government approached trafficking, from treating it as primarily a law enforcement problem to recognizing it as a human rights issue that required comprehensive, survivor-centered solutions. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to depart, Marcus walked through the therapeutic gardens where several current program participants were working. The January air was cold, but the greenhouse facilities allowed year-round programming that kept survivors engaged in meaningful activities even during Colorado's harsh winters. Ana Gutierrez, the young woman whose escape had triggered the Arizona investigation, was among the newest program participants. She had requested transfer to the Wheeler Foundation after completing initial recovery services in Phoenix, saying she wanted to be part of the program that had inspired hope during her darkest moments. "Mr. Marcus," Anna called as she tended to seedlings in one of the greenhouses. "Miguel told me that Elena is coming to visit next week. I can't wait to meet her." The connections between survivors across different rescue operations had become one of the Foundation's most powerful tools for healing. Knowing that recovery was possible, that others had successfully navigated the journey from victim to survivor to advocate, provided hope that sustained people through the difficult early stages of their recovery. The Wheeler Ranch would never again be the simple cattle operation that Marcus's grandfather had established, but it had become something far more significant, a place where the worst of human nature was transformed into the best, where exploitation was replaced by empowerment, and where broken lives were rebuilt into stories of hope that inspired an entire nation. 10 years after Miguel Rodriguez first collapsed in Marcus Wheeler's irrigation ditch, the young federal prosecutor stood before the Supreme Court of the United States, preparing to argue the most significant human trafficking case in American legal history. The case, Rodriguez versus Meridian Industries, would determine whether corporations could be held liable for trafficking operations conducted by subcontractors, even when the parent company claimed ignorance of the criminal activity. Marcus watched from the gallery as Miguel, now 25 and the youngest attorney ever to argue before the Supreme Court in a trafficking case, organized his notes at the counsel table. The transformation was complete. The terrified 12-year-old, who had once begged not to be sent back to work, had become the lead prosecutor in a case that would reshape how American law addressed corporate responsibility in human trafficking. Chateau's case had originated from a class-action lawsuit filed by survivors of the original Colorado and Arizona trafficking networks. After years of appeals and legal maneuvering, it had reached the nation's highest court with the potential to establish precedent that would affect thousands of future trafficking cases. "Mr. Rodriguez, you may begin," Chief Justice Patricia Williams announced, her voice echoing through the marble-columned chamber. Miguel stood with the confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. His opening statement was personal without being emotional, legal without being dry. "Chief Justice Williams, and may it please the court," Miguel began, his voice steady and clear. "This case is about whether American corporations can profit from child labor by simply claiming they didn't know where their profits came from. The petitioners in this case were children who worked in fields, lived in locked buildings, and were bought and sold like commodities. The respondent corporation received financial benefits from their labor while maintaining systems designed to avoid learning about their suffering. The legal arguments were complex, involving questions of corporate liability, federal jurisdiction, and the intersection of immigration law with human trafficking statutes. But at its core, the case was about accountability, whether companies could insulate themselves from responsibility by creating layers of subcontractors and plausible deniability. Justice Robert Chen, the newest member of the court, asked the question that went to the heart of the case. Mr. Rodriguez, isn't there a difference between actual knowledge and willful blindness? How can we hold corporations responsible for criminal activity they genuinely didn't know about? Miguel's response drew on years of experience investigating trafficking networks. Justice Chen, the evidence shows that Meridian Industries designed their subcontracting relationships specifically to avoid learning about labor conditions. They required unrealistic production quotas at below-market prices, creating economic pressures that could only be met through exploitation. This wasn't ignorance. It was willful blindness designed to maintain legal protection while profiting from criminal activity. Marcus felt pride watching Miguel navigate the complex legal arguments, but he also felt the weight of how much had changed since that first day in the hospital when Miguel had been afraid to speak at all. The boy who had once asked if he would have to work in the fields tomorrow was now arguing before the nation's highest court for protections that would help thousands of future victims. The case had broader implications beyond trafficking law. Corporate accountability, supply chain responsibility, and the intersection of immigration and labor rights were all being debated through the lens of Miguel's experience and the experiences of dozens of other survivors who had joined the lawsuit. Elena Martinez, now Dr. Elena Martinez, after completing her veterinary degree and a PhD in animal-assisted therapy, sat beside Marcus in the gallery. She had testified as an expert witness in the lower court proceedings, explaining how trafficking trauma affected children's development and why traditional legal remedies were inadequate for addressing the scope of harm caused by systematic exploitation. "He's extraordinary," Elena whispered to Marcus as Miguel fielded questions from the justices. "Can you imagine if someone had told us 10 years ago that Miguel would be arguing before the Supreme Court?" The transformation wasn't limited to Miguel. Elena's research on animal-assisted therapy for trafficking survivors had been published in major psychology journals and was being implemented in recovery programs across the country. Her work had demonstrated that interaction with animals could accelerate healing in ways that traditional counseling approaches couldn't match. Rosa Delgado had become the director of the Texas Regional Anti-Trafficking Center, one of the Safe Harbor Initiative centers based on the Wheeler Foundation model. Her center served over 200 survivors and had achieved recovery success rates that rivaled the original Colorado program. Carlos Mendez had used his agricultural expertise to establish an organic farming cooperative that employed trafficking survivors and provided them with both income and therapeutic work experience. The cooperative's products were sold through a national grocery chain that had committed to trafficking-free supply chains. Even Ana Gutierrez, the young woman whose escape had triggered the Arizona investigation, had become a social worker specializing in immigrant children's services. She was completing her master's degree while working with recently rescued trafficking victims in California. The Supreme Court arguments concluded after 2 hours of intense questioning. Legal experts predicted that the court's decision, expected within 6 months, would either strengthen corporate accountability standards or create new protections for businesses operating in industries with high trafficking risks. That evening, Marcus hosted a dinner at a Washington restaurant for the survivors and advocates who had traveled to witness the arguments. The gathering included people whose lives had been transformed by the events that began with Miguel's broken arm 10 years earlier. "I want to propose a toast," Miguel said, standing at the head of the table, "to Marcus Wheeler, who taught us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is admit when something is wrong and then do everything in your power to make it right." The toast was emotional, but Marcus deflected the attention back to the survivors. "Miguel, you and everyone at this table taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. The real heroes are the people who survived unimaginable trauma and then dedicated their lives to making sure others don't experience the same suffering." Dr. Sarah Kim, the pediatrician who had joined the Wheeler Foundation as clinical director, had been documenting the long-term outcomes for trafficking survivors who had participated in their programs. Her research was groundbreaking, showing that comprehensive, community-based recovery programs could achieve success rates that traditional government services couldn't match. "We're seeing something unprecedented," Dr. Kim explained to the group. "Survivors who complete programs like the Wheeler Foundation don't just recover, they consistently outperform their peers in education, employment, and social integration. The trauma-informed, community-based approach creates resilience that extends far beyond addressing the immediate effects of trafficking." The research had attracted international attention. Delegations from European countries, Canada, and Australia had visited the Wheeler Ranch to study their approach. The model was being adapted for different cultural contexts and implemented in recovery programs worldwide, but success had also brought new challenges. The Wheeler Foundation now operated 5 regional centers across the western United States, serving over 300 survivors annually. The scale of operations required sophisticated management structures that sometimes threatened the personal, community-based approach that had made the original program so effective. "We're at a crossroads," Marcus explained to Sarah during their flight back to Colorado. "We can continue expanding and risk losing what makes our approach special, or we can maintain our current size and turn away survivors who need our help." Sarah had been wrestling with similar questions about her own role. As the foundation had grown, she had transitioned from managing day-to-day operations to overseeing policy development and staff training. The work was important, but she missed the direct interaction with survivors that had originally motivated her involvement. "Maybe the answer isn't choosing between expansion and intimacy," Sarah suggested. "Maybe it's about creating networks of smaller programs that maintain the community-based approach while sharing resources and expertise." The conversation continued as they drove from the Denver airport back to the ranch. The Colorado landscape looked different now than it had 10 years earlier. What had once been struggling agricultural communities were now thriving areas with diverse economies that included technology companies, renewable energy projects, and sustainable agriculture operations. The Wheeler Ranch itself had evolved far beyond its original therapeutic programs. The property now included a research center where academics studied trafficking recovery methods, a training facility where law enforcement officers learned to identify and investigate trafficking cases, and a conference center where advocates from around the world gathered to share strategies and coordinate efforts. Miguel had purchased a small house near the ranch after completing law school, wanting to maintain his connection to the place where his recovery had begun. His career with the Department of Justice was demanding and required frequent travel, but he considered the ranch his home base. "I know it sounds strange," Miguel had told Marcus during a recent conversation, "but I feel most like myself when I'm here. This place reminds me that no matter how bad things get, recovery and healing are always possible." Elena had made a similar choice, establishing her veterinary practice in nearby Fort Collins, but maintaining an apartment at the ranch for weekends and extended stays. Her work with the Foundation's animal-assisted therapy programs was voluntary, but she considered it essential to her professional and personal fulfillment. The strong connections between the original survivors had become one of the Foundation's most powerful tools for helping newly rescued children. Seeing Miguel in his federal prosecutor role, Elena as a successful veterinarian, Rosa as a program director, and Carlos as a business owner provided concrete evidence that complete recovery was possible. Hope is easier to believe when you can see it walking around, Dr. Kim had observed. These young people don't just tell new survivors that healing is possible. They embody that possibility. The winter of Miguel's Supreme Court argument was particularly harsh, with heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for several days in February. Marcus used the forced downtime to work on a book he had been writing about the Foundation's first decade of operations. The book, tentatively titled From Exploitation to Empowerment, Lessons from the Wheeler Foundation, was co-authored with several survivors who wanted to share their stories as a way of helping others understand both the reality of trafficking and the possibility of recovery. "I want people to understand that we're not just victims who got lucky," Elena had written in her chapter about recovery through education. "We're survivors who did the hard work of rebuilding our lives, with support from people who believed we could succeed." Miguel's chapter focused on the importance of legal accountability in trafficking cases. "Justice isn't just about punishing criminals," he had written. "It's about creating systems that protect vulnerable people and provide them with opportunities to rebuild their lives." The book was scheduled for publication in the fall, with proceeds supporting the Foundation's scholarship program for trafficking survivors pursuing higher education. 23 survivors were currently enrolled in colleges and universities across the country, studying fields ranging from medicine and law to education and social work. As spring arrived at the ranch, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The financial crisis that had nearly destroyed his family's legacy 10 years earlier now seemed like a small price to pay for the opportunity to be part of something that had touched so many lives. The Supreme Court decision in Rodriguez versus Meridian Industries was announced on a warm May morning. In a 7-2 decision, the court ruled that corporations could be held liable for trafficking operations conducted by subcontractors when evidence showed willful blindness to exploitation indicators. Miguel called Marcus with the news, his voice filled with emotion. "We won, Mr. Marcus. The court ruled that corporations can't profit from trafficking by simply looking the other way. The decision would affect thousands of future trafficking cases and create new legal tools for holding corporations accountable for exploitation in their supply chains." But for Marcus, the real victory had happened years earlier, when a frightened 12-year-old boy had found the courage to trust a stranger who promised to help him. Standing in the same fields where Miguel had once worked under threats of violence, now watching current program participants tend gardens they had planted themselves, Marcus understood that some transformations were worth any price. 15 years after a broken-armed 12-year-old changed the course of his life, Marcus Wheeler stood before a gathering of 500 people in the main hall of the Wheeler Center for Justice and Recovery. The occasion was the Foundation's anniversary celebration, but it felt more like a family reunion than a formal event. Miguel Rodriguez, now 37, and serving as a federal judge after his nomination by President Morrison, delivered the keynote address. His appointment to the bench 3 years earlier had made national headlines. The first trafficking survivor to serve as a federal judge, presiding over the very type of cases that had once defined his childhood trauma. 15 years ago, I was a child who believed his life was over, Miguel told the assembled crowd of survivors, advocates, law enforcement officials, and community supporters. Today, I have the privilege of ensuring that other children never experience what I experienced. This transformation wasn't magic. It was the result of one man's decision to choose protecting children over protecting himself. The Wheeler Center had grown far beyond anything Marcus had envisioned during those early days, when he was simply trying to help Miguel heal from his broken arm. The facility now sprawled across 200 acres, including residential facilities for up to 150 survivors, educational programs from elementary through college level, vocational training centers, and research institutes studying trafficking recovery methods. Elena Martinez, now Dr. Elena Martinez, and the director of the International Center for Animal-Assisted Trauma Recovery, had revolutionized treatment methods for trafficking survivors worldwide. Her research showed that structured interaction with animals could accelerate healing in ways that traditional therapy alone couldn't achieve. Programs based on her work were operating in 23 countries. The horses don't care about our past, Elena explained to a group of newly rescued children during an orientation session. They respond to who we are right now, in this moment. They teach us that we can be trusted, that we can be gentle, that we can nurture life instead of just surviving it. Rosa Delgado had established the National Survivor Leadership Council, an organization that ensured trafficking survivors had direct input into policies affecting them. Her work had influenced federal legislation, international protocols, and local law enforcement training programs across the United States. Carlos Mendez's agricultural cooperative had grown into a national network of survivor-owned businesses that employed over 400 people and generated millions in revenue while maintaining strict ethical labor standards. His success had inspired similar ventures in other industries, proving that business models could be both profitable and protective of vulnerable workers. Ana Gutierrez had become the youngest person ever appointed to lead a state's anti-trafficking task force. At 32, she oversaw California's comprehensive approach to identifying, rescuing, and supporting trafficking victims while coordinating with federal agencies and international partners. The evening's program included video messages from survivors around the world who had been influenced by the Wheeler Foundation's work. A young woman in Thailand who had escaped forced labor and was now studying medicine. A teenager in Guatemala who had been rescued from a trafficking ring and was training to become a teacher. A former child soldier in South Africa who was using animal therapy techniques learned from Elena's program. The ripples keep spreading, Sarah Wheeler observed as she watched the video testimonials with Marcus. Now in her 60s, Sarah had become a nationally recognized expert on family recovery after trafficking, helping relatives understand how to support survivors in their healing journey. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what had grown from that single decision to help an injured child. The financial struggles that had nearly destroyed his ranch 15 years earlier seemed like events from another lifetime. The Wheeler Ranch was now debt-free, supported by a $50 million endowment that ensured the programs could continue in perpetuity, but the personal cost had been significant. The constant travel, media attention, and security concerns had taken a toll on Marcus's health. At 67, he was beginning to step back from day-to-day operations, though he remained actively involved in strategic planning and survivor mentorship. "Marcus, you've created something that will outlast all of us," Judge Miguel Rodriguez said during a private conversation after the celebration. "But more importantly, you've shown that ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things when they're faced with injustice." The relationship between Marcus and Miguel had evolved over the years from rescuer and victim to something resembling father and son. Miguel had legally changed his last name to Rodriguez Wheeler after completing law school, honoring both his birth family and the man who had given him a second chance at life. Miguel "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, as they walked through the memorial garden that honored trafficking victims who hadn't survived to see rescue. "You saved me as much as I saved you. Finding you that day gave me a purpose I never could have discovered any other way." The memorial garden was Elena's design, featuring plants and trees from around the world representing the global nature of trafficking. At its center stood a fountain with an inscription: "For those whose voices were silenced, whose dreams were stolen, whose lives were lost. Your memory lives in every child we save." The Wheeler Foundation's impact extended far beyond the survivors it had directly served. Marcus's book, From Exploitation to Empowerment, had become required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. The Foundation's research had influenced how law enforcement investigated trafficking cases, how courts processed survivor testimonies, and how communities identified vulnerable populations. The Safe Harbor Initiative, inspired by the Wheeler model, had established regional centers in all 50 states. While not all achieved the same success rates as the original Colorado program, the overall impact had been substantial. Over 5,000 trafficking survivors had received comprehensive support services and detection of trafficking operations had increased dramatically. "We've changed how America thinks about trafficking," Dr. Sarah Kim noted during the anniversary celebration. "It's no longer seen as just a law enforcement problem or an immigration issue. It's understood as a human rights crisis that requires comprehensive, survivor-centered solutions." The international recognition had led to consulting work in dozens of countries. The Wheeler model was being adapted for different cultural contexts, from rural communities in Southeast Asia to urban centers in Eastern Europe. The core principles, treating survivors as whole human beings, providing comprehensive support, and involving survivors in designing their own recovery, proved effective across different societies and legal systems. As the celebration wound down, Marcus found himself sitting on his porch with Sarah, watching the sunset over land that had witnessed both unspeakable exploitation and remarkable healing. Their daughters, now in their 30s with children of their own, brought the next generation to the ranch regularly, continuing the family's connection to this work. "Do you ever regret how our lives turned out?" Sarah asked, taking his hand, as they watched children from the current program playing in the therapeutic gardens. "Never," Marcus replied without hesitation. "We lost a cattle ranch and gained something infinitely more valuable. We gained the knowledge that we can make a difference when it matters most." The evening air carried the sound of laughter from children who were no longer afraid, the voices of young adults planning their futures, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that work has meaning beyond profit or recognition. Judge Miguel Rodriguez stopped by the porch before leaving. For the airport, he was flying to Washington for a judicial conference, where he would present findings about the long-term effectiveness of trauma-informed justice practices in trafficking cases. "Mr. Marcus, there's something I want you to know," Miguel said, settling into a chair beside them. "Last week, I sentenced a man who was running a trafficking operation in New Mexico. Before I imposed the sentence, I told him about a 12-year-old boy who was rescued from a similar operation 15 years ago. I told him that boy grew up to become the judge who was now sending him to prison for the rest of his life. The symbolism was perfect. The victim had become the instrument of justice. The exploited child had grown into the protector of other children. It represented the complete transformation that Marcus had witnessed countless times over the past 15 years. As Miguel's car disappeared down the ranch road, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The man who had once been desperate enough to lease his land to unknown companies without asking enough questions had become someone who asked difficult questions about everything and never accepted easy answers about complex problems. The Wheeler Ranch would continue its work long after Marcus was gone. The endowment ensured financial stability. The staff was experienced and committed, and most importantly, the survivors themselves had become leaders who would carry the mission forward. Elena had recently announced her engagement to Dr. James Park, a trauma surgeon who had been inspired to specialize in treating trafficking survivors after meeting her at a medical conference. Their wedding would be held at the ranch in the spring, surrounded by the community that had watched them both heal and grow. Rosa's daughter, born 5 years earlier, played regularly with other children at the ranch. Watching Rosa navigate motherhood, with the strength and wisdom she had gained through her own recovery, was a powerful reminder that healing was not just possible, but could extend to future generations. Carlos had purchased his own ranch the previous year, implementing sustainable farming practices that employed survivors while proving that ethical agriculture could be profitable. His success had inspired other survivors to start their own businesses, creating a network of enterprises built on principles of dignity and fair treatment. As darkness settled over the Colorado plains, Marcus walked through the facility one final time before bed. In the residential halls, teenagers who had been rescued from trafficking operations were studying for college entrance exams. In the counseling centers, newly rescued children were beginning their healing journeys with therapists who understood their experiences because many had survived similar trauma. In the agricultural therapy areas, young people who had once been forced to work in fields under threat of violence were now choosing to work with soil and plants as part of their recovery, reclaiming agricultural work as something that could nurture rather than exploit. The Wheeler Center for Justice and Recovery had become more than a treatment facility. It was a symbol that the worst human experiences could be transformed into forces for good, that exploitation could become empowerment, and that one person's decision to do the right thing could create changes that would echo through generations. Standing in the same fields where this journey had begun 15 years earlier, Marcus knew that some victories were worth any price, and some transformations were so profound that they changed not just individual lives, but the world's understanding of what was possible when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. The Wheeler Ranch would never again be measured by cattle production or agricultural profits. Its legacy would be counted in lives saved, futures restored, and a growing community of people committed to ensuring that exploitation would always face resistance from those who had survived it and those who chose to stand with them. And Marcus Wheeler had set out to save a ranch and had ended up helping to save the world, one child at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just you click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.